right, 1:15 exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Seats back here.
All right, welcome everyone. We are here at the breakout session, COVID, climate change, and conflict. Who's in charge? We are here until 2 o'clock. I'm Sean Morrison. I'm the Associate Dean of the School of Languages, Cultures, and World Affairs. And I would like to ask you before I introduce our speakers, if you could all remember to silence your phones. That would be lovely. Thank you. All right, we have Brian Finlay and Bruce McConnell, and we have a student with us as well, which is great. You all have the information in your program, so I'm just going to do a super brief introduction, not to take time away from them. Brian Finlay is president and CEO of the Stimson Center. Prior to joining the center, he served as executive director of a Washington-based lobbying initiative focused on counterterrorism issues, a researcher at the Brookings Institution, and a program officer at the Century Foundation. Bruce McConnell is a distinguished fellow with the Stimson Center, and he has served on the Stimson Center Board of Directors since 2021. He's been a leading player on global cyberspace peace and security issues at the intersection of governments, business, and civil society for more than 30 years. And then Andrea Kimpson is an international scholar at the college, and she is majored in international studies and economics. Welcome.
Great. Thank you, Sean. We appreciate all of you coming out here today. We have made a change in the lineup with Andrea Kimpson, a junior here at the college. Many of you will remember her excellent remarks yesterday morning. Brian and I have both taken the pledge not to participate in what a French friend of mine calls manels. So this is no longer a manel, we have a panel. Brian?
Yeah, so we thought we would mix this up a little bit, and rather than kind of talking at you for the next 45 minutes, we would just try to engage you in a little bit of a conversation. And maybe to start with that, Bruce, I'm going to turn and ask you the first question. And then we're going to have a little discussion among the three of us. And then really I kind of want to hear from all of you as well. I think we all do. So when we titled this panel, Bruce, back a couple of months ago, it seemed like we were cutting edge, talking about COVID, climate, and conflict. You remember COVID and climate? Remember they used to have those things? Yeah, that seems like a long time ago. The world has changed, obviously, pretty significantly over the course of the past 4 weeks. It looks a little bit more 19th century than it does 21st century in some ways. And so, Bruce, maybe before we get into the question of who's in charge now of these, grand global issues, and who has influence upon them, why don't we kind of set the stage and talk about what the big issues are today? As I say, when we started this conversation, it was really those kind of two issues, predominantly climate and COVID. And I wonder, what are the big issues that you think about today that dominate the international sphere?
Well, I agree the world has taken several steps backwards. Even the military leaders who I talked to had hoped that humanity had moved beyond what we're seeing in Ukraine, not least because of the scale and the lack of proportionality to any even arguable provocation. So you might understand there's a rationale, but not for something like, not the way this is being done by Putin. So certainly at this point, when climate, I was talking to a European friend earlier this week, and I was mentioning that the Mayor of Charleston has identified climate as his #1 issue, climate resilience and response. And my friend said to me, what a luxury. To be able to focus on that, because certainly climate was a key top-level issue in Europe until about 6 weeks ago, and we'll come back to it, obviously. But, at Stimson, you have a very, very broad portfolio, really, not only climate, but you cover China, South Asia, North Korea. Is the crisis having any effect on your team's ability to do its job? And how about your donors? How are major foundations responding?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I mean, for us, it certainly has fundamentally reordered things in a number of different ways. I have a colleague at Stimson who says that our business is conflict, and unfortunately, business is very good, which is a sad statement. And I think it's true. However, I think it's also true. So I feel like I have to admit something to you all. This little bit of an odd accent that you hear. I'm not from the United States. I was born and raised in Canada. And I started my career at the Canadian Foreign Ministry. And what always amazed me in Canada, obviously a much, much smaller country, about the 10th the size of the United States, is how the government got pulled in one direction or another and was really dominated by one issue or another, and seemed you could only be able to do one thing at a time. So when I moved to the United States, to Washington, I thought, wow, this is this is the home of grand sophistication. This is a government that is juggling so many balls simultaneously. And what is amazing to me is it's exactly this, right? It focuses really on, it becomes dominated by one issue at a time, and that issue of the day, it's not surprisingly, and quite rightly, is the conflict in Ukraine. But our work, as you pointed out, Bruce, it extends to many different areas of conflict and crisis and challenge around the world, whether it's climate change, whether it is missile launches in North Korea, whether it is migrants, forced migration in sub-Saharan Africa. We cover all of these issues, Syria, Iran, and those issues have not gone away in light of the crisis in Ukraine. So we're seeing, it's more difficult to get audience to influence the process on these important challenges as a result of the focus on Ukraine. And again, I'm not saying that we should not be focused on Ukraine, but these other issues, continue to boil and risk boiling over as our gaze is averted. To your question regarding donors, we noticed that if you were here, Jonathan Fanton, I saw just walked in the room, and he made the remark in this room yesterday, which is so true. And here's a guy who ran one of the largest foundations in the United States of America for 10 years. And even he says, look, the donor community gets focused on shiny objects, on big issues, and chases issues of the day. And I think it's, in some ways, that trickles down to us as well. So we're doing remarkable work in Syria, where, as you know, there are thousands of people that continue to suffer. And as we try to sort of move that project forward, our donors are saying, yeah, but what are you doing in Ukraine? Let's put Syria on hold for a minute and really focus on Ukraine. But many of those issues are kind of legacy issues for us. And so, Andrea, I'm curious from your perspective. First, thank you so much for joining us. We're really pleased to have you here. Of course. I wonder, as from where you sit, what are the big issues that keep you awake at night? Because in some ways, you're thinking, you have the ability, you're thinking the longer term, right? Than I think either Bruce or I. In part because your lifespan is going to be much longer than ours, but more importantly, you a little bit sitting in academia, you've got that luxury to think much more big picture. So talk to us a little bit about what you see as the biggest challenges.
Yeah, that really hits on the head. I read the title of this panel, so COVID, climate change, and conflict. All of these things are impacting us. They're around us all the time. But again, how will this change our long-term future? How can we better respond in the present to be prepared for a long term? I often hear the phrase history repeats itself, history is cyclical. So we see these, like you said earlier, we're kind of the 19th century again. So have we learned anything from that point to carry us to now? Sometimes I question if we have learned anything. And so I guess in this moment in time, what I think about more is how can we be better responding in academia and communities and civil society to prepare ourselves going forward? Because these issues will reappear again. I think about with climate change, this is going to exacerbate every other issue happening on the planet. We're going to see conflict as a result of migration patterns changing. We're going to see economic issues as a result of the climate. COVID, we're going to see the impacts of a long-term health issue on a majority of the population. How will this change our long-term goals, outlook, abilities? And so in this moment, how can we prepare ourselves and be better ready for what's coming next? That's what keeps me up at night right now.
What's your assessment? How are we doing?
That's a difficult question, right? Sometimes I think, wow, we've got it. And other times I'm like, what just happened? I think we make a mistake. I'm thinking more about how policies constructed here in the United States. We take one step forward and then like a few steps back because we get focused on the big issue at the moment. So I've heard the discussion about the COVID relief compared to what's happening with the aid given to Ukraine. And again, the situation in Ukraine is very pressing. It's very important to fund and provide support that we can. But then people have also said, well, we've still got COVID happening in our communities. There's still need to address the systemic issues that COVID has laid bare. So how do we, again, balance what's pressing in the now versus what will be impacting us in the long term? So I think there is a better need, a better call for balance in these issues. So an overall assessment, we're getting there eventually, slowly, but I think we will get there, fingers crossed. We shall see.
So I was so impressed when you spoke yesterday, Andrea, about, to me, we are all trained, I think, in academia, and that translates to government service and to think tanks and others operating in the international space. I think we're trained to think in silos, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you're the
Yes.
climate expert, and this is our conflict
Yes.
expert, and here's our health expert, right? And we all sit in separate places. And in some ways, when you are in government, that there's so much that's happening that you have to organize yourself
Right, yeah.
in certain ways. But in many ways, I think, particularly in academia and the think tank world, we have the benefit of examining the world a little bit more horizontally, right? That we can look at the seams of these different issues. And you spoke so eloquently about, for instance, that that intersection between climate and migration, right? That how these issues are impacting, or just your comments now on health and how that is impacting in terms of climate. So, Bruce, maybe to come back to you for a minute on the subject of cyber. You spent a little bit of time in the Obama administration running cyber policy, and so now we're a little bit faced in real time, right, with some challenges that we are hearing increasingly. You heard the president yesterday talk with the president of the United States, not the president of college, although I'm sure he has said this as well, that private industry should be, buttoning up the back door, should be getting ready for cyber assaults potentially emanating from Russia. So I have a two-part question for you. One, we heard at the front end of the conflict concern that Russia could launch cyber attacks early on in the conflict, both not just directed at Ukraine, but to the Western allies as well. And I think we have not seen that. We've seen some of it, but we haven't seen a whole lot of it. So why? And two, can you talk a little bit more about, again, we're getting into these sort of intersection, these issues of intersection, the intersection of climate, of cyber and this particular conflict, and kind of where we go from here.
Yeah. Well, Andrea's point about history is cyclical reminds me of my favorite Gertrude Stein quote, which is that those who fail to learn from history are forced to repeat it, and the rest of us are forced to repeat it with them. But I would say on cyber, it's been very instructive because all the people who do cybersecurity, of course, said, okay, there's going to be this, massive cyber attack, right? And the president said yesterday, be careful, there's going to be something bad, is very bad, the bad thing could happen, and everybody's waiting for the bad thing to happen. And there has been a lot, actually, a very sophisticated set of cyber attacks being used by the Russians and Belarus, or at least coming out of Belarus, using tools and techniques that we haven't seen before, that the cyber defenders haven't seen before. These are not the same old tools and techniques. They've saved these up. And the actors are not the same. It's not the easily identifiable, well-known Russian or state actors or state-supported actors or other surrogates. So there was quite a bit, it appears, that there was quite a bit of preparing the battlefield and getting ready for that. And what we're seeing now, of course, what the president talked about is that be aware that there may be more activity on your networks, probes and whatnot at the in critical infrastructure and major companies in the United States. And so in the Ukraine itself, of course, there have been the attacks have been careful so that they haven't brought everything down, partly because they are using the infrastructure as well. It's just like they haven't taken out the railroads, right? And so it's quite sophisticated in that way. But I do also, we all understand that not only are they not using all the conventional and other kinetic weapons that they could use, there's more cyber tools still in the toolbox. And I think part of why we haven't gotten there has been that the cyber defense in the Ukraine has been as good, if you will, as the physical defense, and so there's been a lot of help. One of the things that is quite interesting about this is there's a whole volunteer, the Spanish Civil War developed volunteers, and there are some, patriots and others going to Ukraine now to fight in the trenches, so to speak. But you also see hundreds of thousands of volunteer hackers on various sides. You really can't tell who's doing what. But there have been some pretty interesting takedowns of websites, official websites, and other things in Russia by these volunteer groups that are not, surrogates, at least of the U.S. government. So I think it's, this is a thing that everybody in the cyber community anyways is watching very closely as the first large-scale conflict where it's not just in theater use against military forces in that area. And it gets me to something we wanted to talk about also, which is, because we're supposed to get around here to who's in charge, which we'll do in a minute. But I wanted to ask Andrea, one of the things we talk about cyber, and it's all about, viruses and backdoors and takedowns, but the other piece of cyber that is adjacent, if you will, an adjacent field is the field of disinformation and social media. So, Brian, of course, is an expert on social media, but I, of course, being an older guy, am not as much. And so we thought we would ask Andrea, what are you thinking, and how is social media playing in this context of the current struggle, the shiny object, but more generally, how are you and your peers, using it and feeling used by it?
Yeah, I would first say that it is very surreal to be watching what's happening in Ukraine in real time on Twitter. I don't think I could have ever conceptualized what that might be like to watch a war play out through my phone. I think it adds a different character to the conflict. So we can see people fighting and struggling and changing their lives dramatically, and really empathize with them because we have a direct connection with them, which I think is very different. And I would also say on the issue of misinformation, I think we can readily agree that it's very easy to, one, silo yourself online because algorithms, things like that, they cater to the content you want to see. So it's easy to be stuck in a cycle of misinformation. At the same time, there's so much information, it's hard to know who to trust. It's hard to know which sources are accurate, which sources are reliable, when content has been updated, when things are outdated. And there is not a high degree of maybe media literacy in that regard and understanding what is available, what's trustworthy. And so I think because of how much information is out there, how easy it is for us to be stuck in our own social media kind of roots, it makes it hard to really accurately engage with this conflict in a meaningful manner, I would say. So it's, again, very easy for me to say something that I saw on an infographic, but how accurate is that and what does it actually mean in the larger context of things? And so that's another thing, we take things out of context in social media. Again, it's a very snapshot, very minute moment in time. Beyond that, what is left? And I think that's where a lot of us might get stuck, or we might focus on that momentary rather than the bigger picture, the larger context.
So, I mean, what's interesting to me about this conversation and the issues, at least that we've touched on, is that we are seeing, I think, a proliferation of actors. I mean, the cyber issue being one, but you could take climate or any issues that we work on at Stimson. I mean, I think about, we're actively training peacekeepers in sub-Saharan Africa in effective management of migrants that are being forced across borders. We adopted a rhino sanctuary in sub-Saharan Africa and built a public-private partnership with technology companies that for some was about saving animals, for some was about preserving the livelihoods of the local population that relied on all of us taking our families on safari. And some, it was a security issue, right? Because the proceeds that were going, were coming from sawed-off rhino horns were funding terrorism in East Africa and beyond. Likewise, we're running Track 2 dialogues, and thanks to the East-West Institute between the Iranians and the Saudis, we're active between the United States and Russia. David Firestein is here, having inherited some work as well from the East-West Institute, as did we, US-China related. And so, you have all of these different actors, and I suspect if we asked David to, enumerate the actors that are involved in the dialogues, yes, of course it's government, but it goes well beyond government. It's private industry, it's civil society organizations, NGOs, and it's individuals, right, that are having an influence on philanthropists, that are having an influence on these issues. And so I wonder if, Andrew, we can kind of a little bit turn, I'd like to talk a little bit more about that, and we'll draw some people in, but I wonder if you could talk again a little bit about academia specifically and how you have, in your experience here at the college, and you see your colleagues as well, the influence is quite remarkable already that you are having. How do you see academia playing a role and ultimately setting you up for career to influence these kind of broader trends?
Yeah, I would first point out this term that we throw around in the Honors College quite a bit, scholar citizen. And so this is someone who is engaged intellectually, academically, and they take that knowledge and go into the community and engage critically with issues. There's that duality there, scholar and citizen. And I would point towards that as being very important, because we can learn everything in the world in the classroom, but it has to mean something, it has to be actionable. So going into the community, going out into the world to discuss that and really engage with those ideas, using the knowledge that we've got, using the experiences that we gained, that's what really makes the difference. And so I would say and this is something I've always struggled with, especially with the econ department, going from the theoretical to the practical. How do we take all that we learned, this nebulous abstract concepts, and how do we make them something actionable? How do we make them something real for people beyond academia? And so going beyond our institution walls and thinking how we can convey the same information, how we can support organizations, how we can support philanthropic missions, all of that is something that academia is being challenged with right now, especially given the events of the world that are facing or causing academia to go through a bit of a revolution in a sense. Students aren't attending college as much. We've got people who are not able to stay in college due to high costs. So academia is being confronted with challenges of how do we continue to draw in people to become academics, but then how do we again meet them where they are, meet them at their needs. So that combination between being the scholar citizen and then also understanding how we need to continually redefine our role in a changing world. That's where academia is right now, in my opinion, but I'm sure a lot of you all have different opinions about it.
You know, one of the things we talk about in global governance discussions around internet governance is that the internet is a multi-stakeholder environment, right? So governments have some important role in it, but the private sector is huge, and international organizations and civil society, academia, and even popular movements. And I think in some ways, cyberspace is kind of the canary in the coal mine, or pioneer on some of these kinds of questions that get explored. And we're now in a multi-stakeholder environment for policy and leadership, even though states, in theory anyway, maintain the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. There's a lot of other actors. And if you look, in my view anyway, at the international organizations, intergovernmental organizations, and our response as a human planetary society to the COVID thing, it was not the best story, right? We did not mobilize together. We instead used vaccine diplomacy to replicate the kinds of conflicts that we already have and mirror them in the context of competition rather than collaboration. And I think one of the things I want to do is turn to John and Izzo in a minute and ask him his views on sort of what does the future of collaborative organization at a national level look like. But how do all these different things we've talked about? I talked about international organizations. You talked about academia. What about the private sector? How is that? What's your take on that part of the economy in this context?
Yeah, so I think about it that unfortunately this student group right here came to Washington recently, and they had heard all of this already, so they may storm out of the room.
Maybe they could just tell
if they have to hear it again. They'll tell it in a much more interesting way than I could, I can assure you. So a lot of our work at Stimson really has increasingly recognized that in truth, all of these big issues, global health, you take the most nettlesome challenges and even the hardest security challenges, the ability, I think, of government in truth to effectively manage these challenges is dropping so precipitously. And this generation, I think, will be responsible for redefining how other actors, particularly private industry, I think, is playing an increasing role and can play an increasing role. We're seeing it again a little bit unfold in real time in Ukraine, where governments certainly led through sanctions, and now we have private actors, Starbucks and McDonald's are pulling out of Russia and adding sort of a level of I think complexity to Putin's calculus. We did a study a number of years ago. We do a lot of work in South Asia, looking at the new prospects for nuclear conflict and trying to de-escalate tensions between India and Pakistan. And you may recall a number of years ago there was touched off a terrorist incident in which a group of heavily armed Pakistani militants crossed. They attacked the Indian parliament. Big firefight. It touched off something called the Twin Peaks crisis. That it looked as if, well, tensions between those two countries, wax and wane over time. On the conventional side, it looked for a period like it could go nuclear, but the two countries could actually have a nuclear exchange. The international community, of course, their hair was like this, as it should have been, and this was during the Bush administration, and the Deputy Secretary of State was dispatched to do what's called shuttle diplomacy between the two capitals to try to decrease tension. The UN Secretary General was attached similarly to try to decrease tension. And the story that we are all told is that over time, international diplomacy helped lessen the conflict. The true story, as we found, in fact, was that the State Department had issued a travel advisory, an advisory for all American citizens in South Asia should leave. They should leave India and Pakistan immediately for fear that there could be a nuclear exchange and obviously put the American citizens in danger. So you might imagine that the CEO of Intel and of American Airlines and Delta Airlines, that had made significant investments in the region through call centers and R&D and production facilities, are waking up and saying, well, look, the head of my American facility there, but Jack's got to go home. He's got to come back to the United States. And so they came together, these American CEOs, and they reached out to the leaders of the two countries, and they said, your actions are bad for business, and we've made significant investments in your two countries, and if you two can't get along, we will leave and we will never come back. And almost immediately tensions between the two countries dropped, right? Because we started talking about financing and money, and it made a significant difference. So it gives the power, even on something, the prospects for a nuclear war, the ability of private sector to influence positively the future direction of conflict is quite astonishing. And so I think, for many of these folks, I think students in the room trying to figure out how we tap that for good, right? Not to say that they shouldn't be out making money. That's what the private sector should be doing, right? They should be building markets and making money. But the way they pursue that could actually make a significant change and throw off a significant social value.
Well, we won't get into a whole discussion about the proper governance and role of inside the private sector and values and ESG and those kinds of things. So that's another panel. But before I call on John, and then we'll open it up, the only thing we haven't talked about here in terms of sectors, I think, is sort of popular movements. You being a Canadian, those radical Canadian truckers, right? There's a popular movement that made a difference in something. Certainly disrupted a lot of things in Canada. What about that, and how does that and the connection with social media that we were talking about earlier fit together?
Yeah, with popular movements, I would see it as more like community involvement, community engagement in issues. And I guess in my future goals, I think I'm interested in community-centered policies that are led by communities, invested in by communities. Because those are opportunities to educate individuals on what's really impacting them, engaging all stakeholders in the process of the resolution of these really pressing issues. I would think that you'd have better outcomes as a result. People are invested in their community. They want to see programs and initiatives get forward and move forward. I think that is the way to target individuals. So when we see popular movements like what's happening in Canada, you see the centralization of an idea, of a goal, of a spirit, really, of community encouragement and engagement that supersedes what's happening in the government or what's going on elsewhere. So that level of community connectedness, I think, plays a role in how we can better understand and better resolve issues, even in this very early stages of them. If we can identify communities that may need additional support or may need additional initiatives to help them progress and improve, if we can target them on the front end, that might go a long way in reducing the outbreak of issues that we see continuing in time. And I think that would be kind of where we should begin thinking about, so tying in the private sector, tying in government, but then again, involving communities in this process, because they are the ones that have to live with the policies and the financial implications that happen. So centering people, centering the humanity aspect of it, be a community, I think, is something to think
I don't think you could have asked for a better segue, John.
Yeah, well, thank you, Bruce, for calling on one of the 5 people with a mask. I appreciate that. So a couple of, first on the private sector, of course, I spend most of my world in with major companies around corporate responsibility. And I think, I said yesterday in answer to a question that an interconnected world economically and socially is inherently more stable and safe than a less connected world. So I think this idea of hunkering back now, made in America, made in Europe, let's just all hunker back down, will create a much more dangerous world. Because previously where you had a bipolar world, the US and the Soviets pretty much just played chess games all over the world with supporting different governments in order to keep an equilibrium. In a more multipolar world, business plays, and the connection of economy, I think, plays a role of bringing the world together. And I love that story because it's a perfect example of how if you didn't have that interconnected economy, that lever wouldn't even be there. Wouldn't matter what those business leaders did. I also think the civil society element is a really important piece. Paul Hawken wrote a book called Blessed Unrest. And what Paul basically said is if you look all over the world now, you see the emergence of these civil society grassroots organizations that are working on all kinds of issues from governance to climate, to development, to rights for different groups that are actually have no leader. And he said it's the first time in human history where there's a movement without a leader that is self-organizing, that is actually becoming a major force in the world. So to me, it's a multipolar who's in charge now. Business is in charge, governments are obviously in charge, civil society is in charge, and the capacity of individual citizens, at least within relatively democratic countries, to organize for change, I don't think has ever been more potentially powerful because of the enabling of technology. So, but I think we have to recognize that world is inherently more dangerous in the sense that it is more unstable, right? It's maybe safer too because we're more connected. And it's one of the things I worry, just as an aside, about that we were talking over lunch about the sanctions, right? That history of sanctions is not good in terms of actually working to change behavior. What it will do is isolate Russia even more from the rest of the world, making it, I think, ultimately even more dangerous than it would be in the way it was connected, because there won't be anybody saying, well, look what it's doing to the economy, right? And unfortunately, the Soviet Union had a long time, if you were there during the Cold War, they dealt with deprivation for a long time. So it's not like, they're not able to do that. So anyway, those are my thoughts.
Yeah.
Multipolar world, blessed unrest, which we all are a part of, and business as a major force for good, but they still want to make money. So we have to really work as I am to keep converting them to come to the moral compass, but leading the way.
Yeah. Your point about having the Russians having endured austerity before. I was in Russia shortly after the first set of sanctions after the earlier invasion, and a trusted colleague there who had a long history of working with John Mroz and the East West Institute said, so we see these sanctions. He said, we're used to this. We will tighten our belts. Our belts are already tightened, but we will tighten them further, and we will remember why this happened. So it was not a friendly response. Well, who can we bring in? Who has been sitting out there saying, "My God, these people have no idea what they're talking about"?
All of them.
Hey, Bruce.
Yeah,
I've
Bill.
told you that for years, but
No, I never learned. Yeah.
just one thing
Not
about
only that, he's my lawyer.
just an observation. I'm meeting with 70 general counsels, the Fortune 100, Fortune 500 next week. We'll be talking about all this. But ESG has changed a lot the way the corporate mindset works. And it started out with COVID, then it was George Floyd, and right now where they are on the pandemic, it's so now it's endemic. We stopped it. We got the But it's the young people, it's the generation that are really driving the corporations to change because they want the brightest and best to come to their company, and they may not get them.
Mhm.
So let's now go to Russia. Exxon would have done things a lot differently historically than they did today.
Mhm.
They would have stayed in. I mean, when they were getting the medal for, and all this stuff. But they got out because the shareholder put 3 new directors on Exxon as part of the ESG movement. And so what you're hearing from the corporate world is China's been a human rights issue for a long time. And PG and others got a lot of hell because they went ahead in Beijing, even though they had a human rights issue. But they're saying this is different.
Mhm.
This is like Munich during Hitler. That this is no longer a human rights issue within Russia. This is a threat to Western democracy. So we're going to draw the line there. Now, they'd be terrified if we did sanctions on China because that would just be a whole new disruption. But it's the mindset's just different than we've seen before, and the calculated risk. I agree with John. You want to keep working, but I think the idea is that Russia crossed the line too far this time, and we hope. But we're going to have a panel on China, and the business community said, I'm a ping pong ball. With sanction here in the U.S., then China does it, and I just want you guys to cut all that out and let us do business.
Well, we need to get them to do that same call with the 2 leaders, right?
Yeah.
That they did in the Pakistan India situation. Well, go ahead, please.
Just thinking about what we've been hearing about leadership and thinking about the future and these different intersecting crises, and I'd be interested in the panel's reactions to the idea, or what are the opportunities here that are being created because we've kind of hit rock bottom in certain ways. And I think of, for example, the Europeans have been complacent in their dependency on Russian gas for a very long time. Now they know they need to change, and that change is going to help with the climate problem. And so what are what other things are going on? There's the ESG topic just mentioned. There used to be an idea that people would be good corporate citizens as long as it didn't cost anything. But these companies are losing, they're giving up billions and billions to do the right thing. And that's a paradigm shift in how this works. So what other opportunities are there now to help solve the problems of the future because of circumstances that these crises are creating?
It's a great question.
Yeah, and if you have other ideas, we're not the experts on all these things, So what else? You mentioned ESG, you mentioned oil and the possibility in Europe. Any other ideas?
Well, if you think of the pandemic, you saw countries around the world all trying to deal with the same problem at the same time, and we were all connected in a way that nothing in my lifetime has ever connected us all by that common experience. So what are the opportunities there for us to solve problems together and realize we're all in this together now?
Yeah, and what about the infrastructure? Why didn't do we need to have more empowered WHO? Is that where the breakdown occurred, or is it just an irrelevant question?
I mean, I would just add to that if I can, Bruce, that unfortunately, we live in a world where the cooperation doesn't sell, right? So we don't hear about the positive collaboration that happened during COVID, or the positive collaboration that's happened, pick your crisis, because it's the conflict, right, that we read about on the front page of the newspaper. So I think that at a more granular level, as we get down and investigate where cooperation did make a very meaningful impact. I mean, you had researchers in China collaborating with researchers in Canada, or research at a different level. Throughout the Cold War, we remember it was the scientific community that really maintained the relationship between our two countries in the coldest days of the Cold War. And is there a future, once again, for those communities to kind of come together? So I think that there is more meaningful collaboration. We just need to kind of shine a spotlight on it, I think, in some cases to kind of demonstrate and hopefully not just magnify, but help replicate that sort of success in others. So I think you make a really great point.
So we're getting a lot of mantle here, so we need a little help back there, and then the student here.
So I love this panel, and I'm hearing things like the popular movement. You talk about government, private industry, civil society, and then popular movements, and I'm of an age, and I just love the fact there's so many students here. I haven't been in an environment with this many students in decades. And when I was their age, a really effective, to my perspective, popular movement was the student bodies. It was the protests against the Civil War, of course, motivated in lots because there was a draft going on and the student body was a major focus, but the students really made a difference in the rising up across campuses, and they didn't have the social media that there is today to really coordinate and make things happen. And that helped support the energy for change, the civil rights movement, of the women's liberation movement, because there was a start. I was a history major, but then I was a student. I wasn't looking at what was going on contemporarily with me as history. It was what was going on, because my perspective is a little skewed. But there was a huge impact by folks of your generation as a popular movement. And you have the power of social media, you have the power of consumers, you have the power, as you brought up, as the sought after employees. You have the power as the young entrepreneurs. So I just want to put that out there, that I'm so excited to be here with all of you. And the energy, the abilities, the perspectives, and Andrea, you as a model for the intellectual and the ability to articulate. So you go.
Can I just make a quick reaction?
Sure, yeah.
Thanks for that intervention, Margaret, and I quite agree with you. And I want to just speak from a personal experience at my own organization at SIMS. So if you've spent any time in the Washington think tank community, which I am a part of, you walk around organizations and you realize that the common theme is that they're stuffed with old white guys, right? That used to be the former assistant secretary of or the ambassador of blah, 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 right? And I have nothing against it. I hope to be an old white guy someday. But
how do you keep this up?
Stimson in its earliest days kind of took a little bit of a different tack in that rather than valuing sort of the gray hair and the resume, they valued kind of the ideas that the individual. So as a result, the cohort at the organization is much, much more diverse and much, much younger than most other organizations that are our peer competitors. And the most fascinating thing to me as I sit and observe from my perch across our workforce is, it's stuffed with young folks that they don't understand, they don't believe that the world has to be the way it is right now. They don't believe, right? But you get haggard old guys like Bruce here who believe that they're just, they believe we've tried that before 1,000 times, it didn't work. But these young folks believe, that we can break things and we get to, and they do, and they say things and they upset people and it breaks things and it gets rebuilt differently and better. And so, I just want to reiterate, raise my fist in support, Margaret, of that comment. That it really is. It's a little hackneyed to say, but it is sort of that this generation. It's their responsibility to kind of take what we have broken and fundamentally change it.
No, and it's our responsibility to make it multi-generational, and not only support that generation, but to do it together.
Agreed.
All right, you get the last intervention.
All right, well.
What's your name?
My name is Kate. I'm in the Global Ambassadors Program, so I got to meet some people in DC, but I'm kind of curious about that earlier point of these crises that are really global crises, and we see that in all those different silos, really, but what is it that makes those cause nations and people to isolate versus collaborate? Is it the people? Is it the leaders? Is it private sector? Kind of what factors lead that to lean on the international community or kind of buckle down and isolate, not work with each other?
Great question. Yeah. Andrea, you should start.
Okay. I'm thinking about it from a different perspective. I'm currently in a class about international law and response to some of the big humanitarian crises of the decade. So we talked about the Rwandan genocide for quite a while. And so there is always this fear. It's easier to do nothing and then retrospectively say, oh, we should have done something, rather than it is to be proactive and actually go in and assist a crisis. And so I think that fear of something going wrong, it's always that cost benefit. calculation. So if we get involved and we lean on these international organizations if something goes wrong, that could be much greater than any potential benefit. And so that fear of being wrong, the fear of making a mistake, is so much greater than what we can see the benefit to be. And so I think in the calculus happening in the where decisions get made, that's what's causing kind of this retraction and the reluctance to engage rather than to take a risk. Because it is risky. I mean, there are considerations to make, but I guess someone from the younger generation, I mean, you have to try something. And I, again, would push back on the idea that it's easier to go back and say, we should have done something. It's easier in my mind to do something and then course correct as you go. There are mechanisms, we've gotten to that point where it's possible, so we need to take those risks where they are.
Yeah.
But that's just how I see it.
So that was a much smarter answer than mine, because mine is, I should have gone first. You know what, I think as we look at kind of all of the kind of global ills that we work on at Stimson, it almost always comes down to somebody's making money, right? Whether it's the corporate CEO who is operating perfectly legitimately, or the illicit actor at the port who's moving contraband through it, it comes down to money. And so I think in some cases, many cases, attacking that problem somehow and positively trying to influence it can, I think, have an outsized effect on some of these challenges. And it's true of, whether you're talking about animal trafficking in sub-Saharan Africa or, climate issues in, pick your country in Southeast Asia. It comes down, unfortunately, to money.
And I think the other thing is that there's a kind of global society-wide bias that is, that focuses on, even and particularly in Western society, on the individual, right? So it's like, what's in it for me? And in traditional societies, anyway, on a good day, it was about, well, what's in it for everybody also takes care of you. And this is a mind shift that we have to have, in my personal opinion, and that involves, as we were saying yesterday, the kind of the feminine energy that has to come in as well to balance the patriarchy which is currently in charge. And so I think at your point about taking risks, I'm sure all of us, probably not you, but many of us took risks when we were young that we wouldn't take today, and we got away with it more or less most of the time. So I think that's where we're at, and at a global basis, we've got to move quickly, agilely, and not go back and say, oh, you made a mistake, but yes, what can we learn from that? And now we're out of time, so we will see you all over at Readout.